I tend to agree with that David Stratton line of thinking. Tim Burstall delivered a scion of Australian cinematic potential, an answer to the British New Wave, amusing on the Australian condition, and in being so specific, one of the most ruthlessly existential of all films of world cinema. There's plenty of time, not really. It's about 2,000 weeks. I had the privilege of seeing this film, one which is difficult to access even if one knows their way about the online marketplaces. Tim Burstall was adamant that this film never be seen again. It was such a personal film, one he expected to only be seen upon its release, as most films were, and so its inclusion to posterity he fought against. Burstall would then murder, frankly, Australian cinema with Stork, Alvin Purple, and Jocko Peterson, before Peter Weir resurrected it during the mid-70s. Ozploitation, that 70s phenomena, is overrated, vile, repulsive, sinful dreck. The new wave was superior. Any claims Ozploitation has to punk authenticity are laughable. They were bigoted, cowardly appeals to the most repugnant of Wake in Fright archetypes. Wake in Fright and Walkabout were directed by a Canadian and an Englishman, respectively, though prototypes or originators of Australian New Wave in between Burstall's 2000 Weeks 1969 and Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock 1975, they certainly are indeed. 2000 Weeks features a protagonist who is interested in making his mark in Australia, but what does that matter when one can be the one Australian to have made it well known overseas, or one of the few? The protagonist's friend and associate, whose name was used by Australia's greatest contemporary film writer, or the best the world has ever seen even, has spent time in the UK, bemoans Australia, wants to be an accepted member of a more cosmopolitan clique. He might be just another cultural critic in the UK, but he will stand out even more when he returns home to Australia in order to mock, condescend, and reap the benefits of it shamelessly. One of the most bold and audacious of Australian cinematographic experiments, so much of a vaguely cliché yet piercingly true distillation of the Australian condition via 1960s new wave existential cinema. British New Wave is the most obvious comparison here, of course, that one almost wonders if it is too obvious to adorn 2000 Weeks' praise, but the fact that it was the only one, and that it does exist in the first place, was utterly empowering. That such a film did occur was validation that Australia was not just some accidental culture placed here by a colonial experiment, a waste bin for the English-speaking world, too far away to meaningfully participate, too attuned to being imitators to contribute any artful continuations of the English-speaking canons, a nation whose artists are only relevant if they travel overseas, to the UK or to the United States, and prove that they can stand out on those terms and standards then. But 2000 Weeks did exist, was for Australians, and espoused for the Australian condition as only an Australian film could. One of the best scripts ever written, one of the finest acts of direction and cinematography in the nation's cinematic timeline, Burstall and Robin Copping, or written by Burstall with one Patrick Ryan, Burstall would generally, for a time there, redeem himself with Eliza Fraser, End Play, and The Last of the Knucklemen, and Kangaroo 1987 also maybe, although I thoroughly resent his contemptible cowardice in attempting to stamp out and slaughter Australian film history because he was scared about what the other real men would think of him. Scared of being made fun of by other men, his masculinity at stake, what could be more of a blatant disintegration of one's own masculinity than by admitting you're scared of what other grown men think of you? I mean, by their own logic, right? Unfortunately, it must be said too. Feeling insecure about being mocked for his artistic sensitivity, caring more about his reputation as a real bloke than about the truth, more concerned with reputation than honesty, Tim Burstall committed to the most Australian male pathological behaviour he could have. 2000 Weeks remains one of the great Australian films, although maybe more due to a lack of elevation after its release for Australian cinema at large. It is easy to imagine an analogue for 2000 Weeks existing during the 1940s or 1950s for the UK, America, Canada, or countries in Europe or in Asia, although in Australia we were so mentally insecure, financially stranded, artistically intimidated, and clinically unambitious that it wasn't until 1969 when we composed our own, though what a striking, poignant piece it is, absolutely. There was a fairly flourishing Australian film industry in the silent era. This dissipated, especially after obviously there was the Great War, but also the impact, and once the American films could arrive overseas, it was kind of done, frankly, just as it had occurred in UK and continental Europe. What also occurs is obviously the 1930s is a I mean, the American film industry suffered enough. They had to cut their own corners, even though those films still look fairly expensive and lavish for the time, where they do, even though they're mostly adapting stage plays over in Hollywood. Is the early sound era is the cheapest and easiest thing to do, especially after the 29 stock market crash, of course. And then, Australia, even poorer. They can't summon muster a film industry, certainly not in the 40s during the Second World War, which we were involved in from 39, no little grace period like America had from 39 to 42, 40 Pearl Harbor, before Pearl Harbor. And so Australian's film industry doesn't really pick up again until the late 60s, the 70s, and some of the 80s. There's that 90s moment, which is actually absolute freaking garbage. All that Strictly Ballroom and just like that Baz Luhrmann stuff. Oh my god, The Castle even. Like all those movies are absolute trash. And it makes me hate Australia. Whereas the actual interesting works of Australian cinema is what makes me love Australia. I think I'll be going over more Australian films over the next however many weeks. If it's 2,000 weeks, that would be the remainder of my lifetime, perhaps. I don't think there's probably only 200 really interesting Australian films from the conception of Australian cinema until the present day. There really isn't that many. I think we'll close it here now. Thanks again, everyone. I appreciate it very immensely. It's going to be difficult to track down this film. Don't try. One day it might be released there might be a wider distribution of this film, in which case, purchase it. Until then, employ patience, I'd suggest. So anyway, thanks again, everyone. I appreciate it very immensely.